All right, we're gonna make a video on this bullshit. Code Geass, Rose of the Recapture.
Scars don't have to be hidden, but Derma can help fade old
Let's
and new
see
scars or
how
your
this
money
went.
back.
Last night, I made a wish on a star, and the star answered.
The best way I can describe Code Geass Rose of the Recapture is that the entire story feels like you fed a plot summary of the original Code Geass into a generative AI model and asked it to
Really?
create a sequel that copies almost one-to-one all of the main plot points
I was afraid this was. I was so. You can't do that, man. Code Geass, the original series, was so good. Akito the Exiled was a good was a good side story. It was like its own self-contained thing within the same world. And yes, Lelouch and Suzaku did show up in Akito the Exiled. Sorry, spoilers. Definitely go watch it though. It's really good. Uh, and the best part about it is like it doesn't affect the main story. The main story itself is really good, and the ending is fucking phenomenal. It's one of my top 10 animes. But I had a feeling that this series was going to be a shit show. It was disappointing because like the movie was bad too. The movie made no sense. It was ugh.
and characters, but with none of the soul and finesse of the original. The premise of the show is that a Britannian splinter group, known as the Neo-Britannian Empire, has somewhat taken over the Japanese island of Hokkaido, where
What?
they rule it with an iron fist, treating the native Japanese population as second-class citizens.
What the fuck?
If any of this sounds familiar, it's because it's an exact copy of the situation at the beginning of the original Code Geass,
That makes no sense.
with Britannia's conquest of Japan, where they rename it to Area 11 and treat the native Japanese population as second-class citizens. If it weren't already apparent, there will be minor spoilers for Rosie of the Recapture and major spoilers
I don't exactly care that much. I'll watch this video, and I mean, I would want to see this series, but at the same time, I really don't want to waste my. I really don't want to waste my time watching something that isn't good.
for the original Code Geass. The main character is Sakuya Subaragi, a betrayed and cast-out member of the Britannian royal family, who has a Geass that allows her to control people, kind of like Lelouch. Her
Are you serious? This is exactly like Lelouch.
primary motivation is to rescue her close childhood friend, who has been manipulated by the big bad on the Britannian side into becoming a figurehead for them, kind of like Donnelly.
Wow.
Sakuya fights alongside Ash, a Britannian assassin who has been manipulated by Sakuya into fighting for her, kind of like Rolo. In order to achieve her goals, Sakuya allies herself with a Japanese resistance group that happens to feature an ace pilot with colorful short hair who goes on to pilot the Resistance's Ace Nightmare frame that just so happens to specialize in close quarters combat.
What the fuck? Are you serious? This is so weird. This is almost like I almost want to say like it's kind of like Star Wars, where the sequel series was just so bad. The prequels were ugh. The original trilogy was great, but the sequels were just garbage and regurgitating the same bullshit.
Kind of like Colin. The leader of the resistance group is a former Japanese military commander who they bust out of a Britannian prison, kind of like Toto. There's also a Britannian knight who defects because he once served the protagonist's mother, kind of like Jeremiah Gottwald. I could go on and on about the similarities.
Oh my god. It's almost exactly like the Star Wars sequels, where it's just like the let's look at Star Wars for a second. You have you have the Death Star, and then you have this giant super planet destroyer, just like the Death Star. Only it's bigger. What the fuck?
The first episode even features a hamstrung chess metaphor that has zero relevance to how the game is actually played in real life.
Right.
Facially, all of the elements of the original Code Geass have been recreated. All they need is Pizza Hut product placement. But the show just feels like a shallow attempt to recreate the original that feels like it fundamentally misunderstands what made the original Code Geass good. To be clear,
Oh yeah, Code Geass, the original series was just such a it had a lot of fucking style to it, for one, and the premise of it was just so unique compared to any other story. It was a banished prince who lived in the now renamed Area 11 and gained this superpower to turn people on his side, turn people to his side and make them do things that he could strategize into his plans. It was such a unique story, and it had probably one of the most poetic endings any story or anime or whatever. It left such a great impact that Attack on Titan tried to recreate it.
Mostly of the recapture isn't offensively terrible by any stretch of the imagination. And in fairness, I'm only writing this while the show is 7 episodes in, so there's always the possibility that the show will really surprise me and dramatically change my opinion. After watching episode 7, it seems like the plot is finally starting to pick up and move in an original direction. But the first 6 episodes really do feel like a hollow cash grab to prey on the nostalgia of people who grew up with the original Code Geass, like myself. For starters, the show has been terribly marketed and promoted. At least anecdotally, I had no idea they were even making this sequel to Code Geass, and I only found out about the show after one of my friends sent me the first episode.
Yeah, I found out about this through some like YouTube video or something, or it came across my feed or something. It was not promoted very well. It had terrible marketing.
When I asked my college roommate whose favorite anime was Code Geass, he told me that he also had no idea that this show was being made, a sentiment that seems pretty common poking around online. It also probably doesn't help that the show is Disney Plus exclusive for some reason.
Why is that?
One of the biggest problems of this show is just how insanely contrived the premise is, just so that it could.
That's why it feels like a fucking recreation of the original, because fucking Disney put its fucking money grubbing hands on it.
Shoehorn in an almost one-to-one recreation of the original. After Lelouch ascended to the throne of the Holy Britannian Empire, it's established that he abolished the aristocracy, with most of the Britannian nobles being either enslaved by his Geass or killed after Schneisel dropped a flea on the Britannian capital of Pendragon. Knowing this, I spent most of the first episode scratching my head, wondering who the hell these guys were claiming to be the continuation of the Holy Britannian Empire. Secondly, you have to wonder how some ragtag Britannian splinter group managed to seize control of the entirety of Hokkaido without the Black Knights and the United Federation of Nations intervening.
Yeah, that's a very weird plot hole right there. I wonder if this gets explained in the video.
To stop them. Presumably, the Black Knights are still in control of the world's biggest military and the absolute behemoths of the Gurren and the Lancelot. So far, the only characters from the original series that have done anything are Cornelia and for some reason Nina, making you wonder why Colin or Suzaku didn't just saunter over and put an end to this whole situation.
Yeah.
The explanation in the show is that Hokkaido is surrounded by some kind of barrier that has allowed them to repel interventions from the Black Knights. The barrier also conveniently saps energy from Sakuradite, explaining the reduction in power level from the end of Season 2 and the Resurrection movie, where seemingly everyone's nightmare is now flying around and shooting energy beams. I'm sure there's some kind of explanation for why a random Japanese island has such an overpowered force field, but it seems to me that this is just an incredibly contrived plot device to allow the writers to retread the guerrilla resistance group versus domineering Britannian military.
Yeah. Exactly. Fucking writers putting themselves in a plot hole.
Dynamic from the original Code Geass Season 1. The timeline only gets more confused in Episode 7 when it's revealed that Norland, the primary antagonist, was a Knight of the Round. He's shown talking to Bismarck, the Knight of One, begging the question of what on earth he
I just noticed he's playing Honkai Star Rail music. That's so funny.
Was doing during the entirety of Emperor Lelouch's reign. As a side note, Bismarck showing up for one throwaway line has to be the most.
I got a tattoo just like that. One Piece. And then I got another one right here too. I'm not gonna show it.
Bismarck thing ever, considering that he shows up for one scene in the original for the sole purpose of showing that Suzaku is so OP, he can defeat a guy who can literally see the future. Apparently, the explanation for all these inconsistencies is contained in a pamphlet that was only distributed to Japanese theater audiences.
What the fuck?
This has to be one of the laziest and stupidest methods of delivering exposition I've ever seen. They could have at least given us a voiceover from C2 explaining the situation. But no, the entire background setting up this show is restricted to physical flyers that only people who watched the show in Japanese theaters got to read. Complaints about world building aside, what made the original Code Geass interesting was seeing how Lelouch connives and schemes, leveraging his Geass power to slowly build.
That was the basis of the whole show. It was Lelouch fucking carried the whole thing because of how fucking smart and tactical he was. And then and then with a cinch of causality, you had recipes of you had a recipe for fucking just amazing story. It flowed so well. There were some moments that were a little bumpy, like the cat episode. I know people have a problem with the cat episode, but overall the story was carried by Lelouch because of how interesting of a character he was.
Build up the Black Knights from a heavily outgunned and outmatched ragtag resistance group into a bona fide fighting force able to resist the Britannians on equal footing.
Exactly.
While Lelouch
turned a small group of terrorists into an elite fighting squad, and eventually an army that could fight against a empire that had dominated that area for a full is it a decade, full decade.
Lelouch succeeds more often than he fails. We see Lelouch stumble a lot, especially in the first season. Seeing Lelouch's arrogance and overconfidence constantly come back to bite him is an important part of his development as a character. After his initial success in the Shinjuku ghetto that allows him to kill Clovis, Lelouch gets lured into a trap by Cornelia, who is aware of Clovis's defeat at the Shinjuku ghetto. Cornelia is then able to turn the tide on Lelouch, trouncing this particular resistance group and nearly capturing him, with Lelouch only managing to get away because of C2's intervention. A big part of what makes Code Geass good is seeing Lelouch develop and mature over the course of the series. At the outset, he's just some high school student with a bigger than average brain that gets granted a supernatural power. Of course, he's going to make mistakes, whether it's being outmatched by Cornelia.
Yeah, because he's a kid. Kids make mistakes, man. Even adults make mistakes. But this is one of the reasons why he's such an interesting character, because he goes through, he wins, yes, but he also goes through these losses because he gets overconfident, he gets prideful, and overlooks some things. Or things just happen sometimes. Like his powers. Now that when his powers kind of went into overdrive, when Yuffie, if any of you remember Yuffie, that was a form of causality that he didn't foresee, and you could argue that it was his arrogance coming back to bite him. No, I wouldn't say it's arrogance. More like he got too comfortable, and he explained his powers to her, and just so happened to say, you know what? You know what happened after that with Yuffie? Yeah.
Or abandoning the Black Rebellion at its crucial moment.
Oh, yeah,
By comparison, it never really feels like there are stakes in Rose of the Recapture. From the very first episode, it's established that Ash is completely overpowered. We watch him basically single-handedly destroy.
Oh my god. Like Rey? Overpowered? Instantly becomes a Jedi?
Like 20 nightmare frames by himself without breaking a sweat.
Wow.
While we do see the
course.
resistance groups getting trounced by the Neo-Britannians, it never really feels like Rose or the protagonists are ever actually at risk because of how insanely strong Ash is. Code Geass has never really been a stranger to throwaway villains that just die without any plot relevance, but Rose of the Recapture tosses them at the viewer at an extraordinary rate, with Ash offing a bunch of supposedly high-ranking members of the Neo-Britannia nobility one after another. Even though Rose of the Recapture facially recreates the guerrilla group versus dominaric military power dynamic of the original, it doesn't have any of the same stakes or intrigue because of Ash. Compare, for instance, the Neo-Britannians' efforts to wipe out a large Japanese settlement with the Flea to Lelouch's battle with Cornelia at Narita, even putting aside the massive question of where on earth the Neo-Britannians managed to procure a—
Yeah, what the fuck? I thought there was only one of those created in Code Geass, and it flew up into the sky and got burned from the sun, or destroyed by the sun. Like, where the fuck does this come from?
Damocles, considering we see the Damocles fly into the
see?
sun at the end
There
of
it is.
Season 2, the battle goes completely in the Resistance's favor, despite the fact that they are ostensibly meant to be significantly outmatched militarily. In the original Code Geass, the justification for why Suzaku can execute the insanely tight execution requirements to make the Flea Eliminator work is because he is able to leverage Lelouch's Geass command to live.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, Ash is able to get the Flea Eliminator to work, albeit with somewhat more relaxed requirements, because he's just that skilled of a pilot. On the other hand, while Lelouch is initially—
See, this is this is the whole like overpowered thing with characters. It completely drains any quality from the show. If the character's flawless, then it's gonna be boring. That makes no sense. And it's like this happens with female characters, and like here it is. It's happening with a male character right now. It's ridiculous. You can make overpowered characters. However, you can't make overpowered characters and make them flawless. That completely just ruins the story. How you can't make a main character flawless. That is probably the stupidest thing you could do. And especially if you make him overpowered. An overpowered character who is flawless should be more of a gag, really. And even then, overpowered characters still are most overpowered characters still have flaws. Like, look at Saitama. He is the epitome of overpowered. He is literally the power ceiling of his world. And regardless of him being overpowered, he still has flaws. He is lazy. He is this very powerful superhero, yet he doesn't really he doesn't really be a hero as often as the other heroes do. He's a hero for fun, and that's part of his flaw. And that's what makes him interesting. That's what makes him almost relatable. Because let's be honest here, if any of us were this strong, would we really be that would you really be that inclined to try and save everyone when you can solve the problem that easily? It becomes mundane to you, in a sense. It's a very human thing to do.
Initially able to get the jump on Cornelia by setting off a massive landslide that takes out a large number of her forces.
Yeah, see?
This still doesn't change the fact that the Black Knights and the Japan Liberation Front are severely outgunned.
Exactly.
The Black Knights and the JLF rely on outdated Budais that are significantly inferior to the Sutherlands that the Britannians field. While the Black Knights have Colin's Gurren, she herself is not enough to single-handedly overcome this massive disparity in forces.
Yeah.
Colin, still being high school aged herself, is still an amateur pilot, and it shows in this battle.
Exactly.
Cornelia is able to fight her to a draw, despite her Gloucester being an inferior unit to the Gurren, and Colin eventually gets the Gurren's
Skill versus power. That is what that fight is. It is a skilled pilot versus a overpowered pilot. Now, Colin in that situation was not as strong as Ash is, but regardless, she was probably the most powerful unit on that field. But her skill as a pilot is what held her back from being able to turn the tide of that battle, in which Cornelia was able to in which allowed Cornelia to change the tide.
radiant wave surger disabled, forcing the Lelouch to call a retreat.
Exactly.
The best encapsulation of how Rose just fundamentally lacks the essence of what made the original Code Geass interesting is in the super hamstrung chess reference in the first episode. The chess metaphors in the original Code Geass were always a little specious, with the game always serving as a useful visual metaphor rather than any deep comparison about the actual rules of the game.
Exactly. That's what made the whole chess thing in the show interesting. It was more of a character introspection, if anything else. It showed what characters what characters really were through the game of chess. Now, you didn't really see how the games were played, but through the actions that you could see, you can tell what characters were like.
For instance, Colin's codename is Q1, signifying her importance as the Black Knight's ace pilot, much like how the Queen is the most powerful unit in chess,
Q1.
while the other more
There you go. Q1.
disposable members are given the designation of pawns. The Lelouch, as the Black King, isn't merely a spectator, but an active participant in the battle.
Exactly.
Despite being the most important piece on the board, he himself is not particularly useful in battle, which is why he operated a Budai with a funny hat for much of the first season, though this metaphor gets a little strained later on when he gets the Gawain and the Shinkido. On the other hand, the chess game that Rose plays against Greed Kirkwain has genuinely zero symbolic or plot importance. It's almost like the writers just thought in them.
It's soulless is what it is. They just threw it in there because this is what writers thought. It looked cool. But they don't understand why it looked cool. They never dug deep as to why adding chess to this story was cool.
Themselves, well, we need to fit some reference to chess into the show because that's just what happens in Code Geass. The watering down of chess as a symbol was a perfect symbolic representation of what's wrong with Rose of the Recapture. It facially reproduces the same elements that made up the original Code Geass without understanding what made them work or what people liked about them. The original Code Geass had many things going on, but at its core, it's a story about competing political and philosophical ideologies. The central conflict for much of the show is between
the Pizza Hut plug. It's crazy.
Lelouch's desire to reshape the world for the better through any means necessary, even if those means are violent and deceptive, and Suzaku, who is steadfastly self-righteous, preferring to work within the confines of the rules, even if it prevents him from ever achieving his grander ambitions. Later on, the show becomes about Lelouch and Schneisel's competing philosophies. Rosie of the Recapture has yet to capture anything deeper in this regard. Another problem with Rose of the Recapture
Anything but hot anime women. That's the main selling point, is hot anime women.
is that the
That's why the main character is a hot anime girl.
new Neo-Britannians are just uninteresting antagonists. They are comically evil, taking the whole killing civilians part of the original to an entirely different level. I made this point in one of the first videos I ever made on YouTube, but from a tactical perspective, arbitrarily killing civilians is a terrible idea. All it does is completely alienate the local population whose support you need and encourages attacks on partisans and guerrillas. The main antagonist has the most obvious Char clone mask.
Oh my god. Are you serious? This is the mask? This is like such Power Ranger vibes, dude. What is this?
It seems to have no real motivations other than just being a massive dick for the sake of it. Of course, this could change in the future,
this
but
is the problem I had with All for One. He was just in My Hero Academia. At first he was such a menacing villain, but then you start to realize he's just a fucking guy that wants to be. It's so annoying seeing that, because he was so interesting at the start, and especially with his design, he looked menacing as hell, and to find out he was just another run-of-the-mill basic ass villain was so annoying. I mean, Shigaraki was an interesting character too, but I couldn't really get into My Hero Academia in the later episodes because I lost all interest in the villain. That's literally what it was.
the Neo-Britannians
Villains are basically the backbone. Antagonists are the backbone. Whereas like the protagonist is like skull of the story. And the spine, that's the plot. You know? No, my bad. I'm confusing it. Backbone. Or is it? I don't know. Is there a difference? A spine and a backbone? Hold on. Now I'm confused. Is the backbone the spine? Spine or back? Yeah, it is. All right. Well, I confused it. Then I would say the plot would be the rib cage. There you go. The head is the skull. The skull is the protagonist, whereas the spine, or aka the backbone, is the antagonist, and the ribcage is the plot in world building.
are caricatures of the originals in all the worst ways. While the Britannians of Code Geass are all clearly racist pricks, some of them do have some legitimate complexity. Cornelia, while a brutal and cutthroat governor of Area 11, shows genuine compassion for Euphemia and her subordinates. Her attack on the Saitama Ghetto has a legitimate military purpose of luring out Zero, unlike the Neo-Britannians who just seem to kill the Japanese for fun and sport.
What the fuck? Can't say it.
Attack using the Damocles seems to have no real strategic relevance, aside from giving the writers an excuse to give Nina something to do and score nostalgia brownie points for bringing the Damocles back. Schneisel, while a calculating and manipulative bastard, has a generally coherent worldview and serves as a useful foil for the Lelouch. Meanwhile, the Neo-Britannians, chief among them Lord Norland von Luneburg, are portrayed as over-the-top evil, with Norland being shown killing literal children in cold blood multiple times. With the exception of Nara, who is seemingly being teed up for a redemption arc, this show's antagonists all seem to either die off without any real plot relevance, or they're just one-dimensionally evil to the point of ridiculousness. As a final
wait. This character. What do you think?
Complaint. I'm also not really a fan of the evil to the point.
There it is. This guy. Hold on. You know who he reminds me of? He reminds me of, let's see. Find him. Where is he? Is this him? This is. That's him. It's this guy. 1 for 1. Absolutely. It's this guy.
Of ridiculousness. As a final complaint, I'm also not really a fan of the new nightmare frame designs for Rosie of the Recapture.
Oh, really?
They all seem extremely busy and not visually appealing to look at, with the CG battles not doing that much benefit. I really like the original mech designs from Code Geass, particularly for some of the early grunt suits like the Sutherlands, Budais, or Gloucesters. I've always been a sucker for grunt suits, particularly those with more militaristic and chunkier designs. The Zowert and Heinrich Sturm are my favorite designs from The Witch from Mercury, if that tells you anything. And of course, the original Lancelot and Gurren designs are iconic classics. This is a problem that the original Code Geass started running into towards the end of its run, and especially in the Resurrection movie. But the mech designs in Rosie of the Recapture are just way too busy.
Yeah.
Ash's Z Apollo, and particularly the combined Z Ortegia, are the prime culprits here. You can also look at the Camden, which serves as the grunt suit for the Neo-Britannians, and compare it to the Sutherlands. It might just be personal preference, but I would take the Sutherlands design any day of the week. Coming off The Witch from Mercury, which has some truly beautiful mech battles with some of the best sound design I've ever experienced.
Oh.
Picture this.
God
You're
damn
sitting
it.
at home alone watching
Ads.
YouTube videos, wondering why you can't find the motivation to
care.
do the things you need or want
I don't
to
care.
What we get in Rosie of the Recapture just pales in comparison, to the point where I still strongly prefer the 2D animation styles of the originals from nearly 20 years ago. The fights in Rosie of the Recapture just don't seem to have the same oomph as the original, with a lot of battles seemingly just consisting of the Z Apollo zipping around at high speeds. The broader issue seems to be that Studio Sunrise just genuinely doesn't seem to know where it wants to take the Code Geass franchise. It's not really a secret that Gundam and Mecha more generally have been in a bit of a rut for the past 20 years.
Oh, yeah.
While Sunrise has had some success with Iron-Blooded Orphans and more recently with The Witch from Mercury, mecha anime has fallen pretty far from the pre-2000s era. The original Code Geass came off the heels of what was possibly the last true breakout mecha hit in the massively successful Gundam Seed and Gundam Seed Destiny. Seed Destiny aired at the highly coveted primetime 6 p.m. broadcast slot on Saturdays. While the original groundwork was being laid for Code Geass, it was assumed that the show would continue in that same time slot vacated by Seed Destiny. However, by the end of its run, Seed Destiny's ratings started to fall off a cliff because of massive production issues that forced them to stuff in a bunch of recap episodes. Because of this, Code Geass got booted from the 6 p.m. time slot to 2 a.m. While the 6 p.m. evening time slot was meant for mainstream audiences, the late night broadcast slot is generally meant for more niche otaku shows. Originally, the plot for Code Geass was meant to be more grounded and less fantastical. In an interview with Okochi Ichiro, the man who wrote the original story and series composition,
I didn't know about
he stated
this.
that the original plan for Code Geass was to have it revolve around two men from the same military unit who have competing ideals.
Wait, really? That was the original plot of Code Geass? Thank God, because we got something fucking 10 times better.
The first character, a commander in his late 20s, got turned into Lelouch, while the second character, a teenager, got turned into Suzaku. It was only after the time slot change that the school setting and Geass were added in to appeal to the late night anime audience. Because of all of these changes in the late night time slot, no one really initially expected Code Geass to blow up into the massive success that it became. By 2008, the franchise had sold over 1 million DVDs, making it a success beyond Sunrise's wildest dreams.
Wow.
I get the sense that during the
course.
2010s, Sunrise just didn't really know where to take the Gundam franchise, considering that there was a
It's because they fucking spent all their creativity on Code Geass. It was, again, it's just fucking that good. It's hard to recreate. It's hard to capture lightning twice. That saying applies here. Like that Code Geass season 1 through 2, pure lightning in a bottle. Akito the Exiled was a nice side story in its own self-contained place, but the main story on its own, fucking just peak.
6-year gap between Gundam 00 and Iron-Blooded Orphans, and then another 6-year gap between Iron-Blooded Orphans and The Witch from Mercury. To fill this dearth of content, the logical choice would be to start leveraging the success of the Code Geass brand.
Right.
The only problem here is that the ending of the original Code Geass was a little too definitive, not leaving much room open for more, considering
Exactly. That the whole point was of season 2 ending the way it did was to literally cap off an amazing story, and it capped it off in the most fantastical way possible. Like no other story has done it like this, and it's crazy.
Lelouch is dead, and he achieved his goal of creating world peace.
Exactly.
Sunrise's first major foray into expanding the Code Geass universe was with Akito the Exiled.
Yeah.
By focusing on the European front during the intermission between seasons 1 and 2, they conveniently sidestepped the whole ending problem,
Exactly.
similar to what Sunrise has done with their many one-year war side stories, like Thunderbolt or the 08th MS team for the mainline UC Gundam franchise. It's been almost 10 years since I've watched the Akito movies, but I remember them suffering from broadly the same issue, where it wasn't entirely clear what direction Sunrise wanted to take this side series. The big symptom of this problem was how they kept giving Lelouch cameos during the Akito movies, but he doesn't really do anything the entire time.
Yeah. That was the one weird plot point about Akito the Exiled. But for me personally, I loved Akito the Exiled. It was definitely better than the movie. And based on this new sequel, it's certainly better than this. So
Lelouch's weird non-role in the Akito movies is reflective of how they both understand how critical Lelouch is to the brand of Code Geass, but they also can't quite figure out how to keep the series going without him, considering, he's supposed to be dead. So to rectify this, they went back to the drawing board and pushed out those alternate timeline movies, where they retconned Lelouch's death so that they could justify making more Code Geass content. They eventually released Code Geass Lelouch of the Resurrection in 2019, and announced that they had a grand 10-year plan for the franchise. The sense I get from Rose of the Recapture is that they're trying to tread a similar path as what happened after the original Mobile Suit Gundam, with the original protagonist in Amado Ray transitioning into something of an elder statesman who is a supporting character in Zeta Gundam before returning to play a more prominent role in Char's counterattack. Likewise, it seems like Lelouch is going to play only a minor, if any, role in Rose of the Recapture, with characters from the original Code Geass making only small cameo appearances. The comparison is also furthered by the fact that the primary antagonist for Rose is an over-the-top Char clone, and the reborn Britannian Empire is called the Neo-Britannian Empire. Very subtle, Sunrise. While Zeta Gundam shares some of the high-level plot points and character arcs as the original Mobile Suit Gundam, the shows have meaningful differences. In the original, it's heavily implied that the Earth Federation is highly corrupt and pretty incompetent, making the conflict of the Titans in Zeta Gundam a logical follow-up. Camille is also a meaningfully distinct character from Amado, even if they still go on to have the same high-level coming-of-age
I never watched Gundam, so this is fairly interesting to see.
story. On the other hand, Rosie of the Recapture attempts to recreate the original a little too closely, copying characters and plot points in a way that neither makes sense given the ending of the original Code Geass and the overall premise of the show. For example, Rose's Geass functions in pretty much the exact same way as Lelouch when they could have easily given her some unique power. The core issue here is that Okochi basically wrote himself into a corner with the ending of Code Geass. The conclusion to Lelouch's story is still over 15 years later, widely held up as one of the greatest anime endings of all time.
Exactly.
So to retcon it for the purposes of milking more money out of the franchise is always going to rub people the wrong way.
Yeah.
To be clear, I don't hate Rose of the Recapture. It's
really?
a perfectly fine show on its own merits. It's not particularly spectacular, but it's also not offensively terrible either. And as a mecha fan, I will take anything I can get at this point. Ultimately, Rose of the Recapture could have easily been a standalone franchise, and I wouldn't have half of these complaints.
Okay.
But by billing it as a sequel to one of the most beloved anime of all time, you will naturally invite comparison. This show has none of the finesse and none of the intricacies that made Code Geass such a beloved show among anime fans. It is at best a cheap copy, and at worst actively undermines the legacy and art of the original.
Damn. Oh man. Oh shit.
At Mint Mobile,
Definitely a good video. Yeah. I might give it a watch if and when I have access to it. But yeah. I wish stuff like this didn't happen, where companies are just milking their franchises that have already ended so well, instead of trying to do something new. I mean, like, you can do Mecha Story without with it looking like Code Geass. However, it doesn't need to be Code Geass. It doesn't need to be. It feels like they're just too afraid to branch out, take risks, you know? But I like this video. Pretty good. Definitely give Gomi-san Gomi? Oh, I see. Definitely give Gomi a subscription and a lot of introspection on that. Yeah. All right. See you guys in the next video.